Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Focus of our conversation tonight is the life, literature, and legacy of Norwegian novelist, Catholic convert, and Nobel laureate Sigrid Undset, as we celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Undset's publication of the first two volumes of the Master of Hestviken. Tonight's event was made possible by the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. The IHE is a leading institute committed to identifying the conditions conducive to human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing scholars from across the university, the country, and the world together to think about these questions and issues that pertain to all of us. I would like to thank especially the excellent IHE staff, Russell Hittinger, Executive Director, Stephen Higgins, Managing Director, and the rest of the team for organizing this event. Before we begin, I have one brief housekeeping item. We have many people and we have time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please submit the question at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits during the Q&A portion, which will run for the final 15 minutes of the event from approximately 8:45 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Clemmons. I am Assistant Research Professor in Biblical Studies at the Catholic University of America, where I teach classes such as Foundations of Theology, Introduction to Old Testament, God's Word and Human Words, currently a seminar on the Song of Songs. And I am very pleased to be joined this evening by Dr. Amy Fahey. Amy is a teaching fellow and director of the Center for Restoration of Christian Culture at Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire, as well as a fellow at the IHE. Her teaching interests include the literature of the Middle Ages, particularly Anglo-Saxon and medieval spiritual literature, writing and rhetoric, and modern poetry. And Dr. Fahey has a piece in a recent volume, Women of the Catholic Imagination, out in 2024, a piece especially on Sigrid Undset. So tonight's event promises to be an intriguing discussion. And without further ado, let's get started. Um, Dr. Fahey, could you orient our audience by giving a picture of Sigrid Undset's early life and influences?
Sure. First of all, I just want to quickly thank Elizabeth for agreeing to participate in this and thank Stephen Higgins and Russell Hittinger and everyone else at the IHE for inviting me to do this. It's really always a labor of love for me to speak about Sigrid Undset. So um, she was born in 1882 in Denmark and to a Danish mother and a Norwegian father. Her father and then moved when she was 2 to Norway and spent, all of her life in Norway apart from, time in exile in America during, the Second World War. And, she, uh, she was born into, her parents were agnostic, the state church of Lutheranism. So she grew up in a pretty secular environment, but in a very loving family and in a very intellectual family. Her father was a noted Norwegian archaeologist, and she tells the story as a child of playing with a little terracotta horse that Schliemann had given her father from Troy. She was also very just incredibly imaginative and well read from a very young age. And one of the formative experiences of her childhood was losing her father. Her father suffered from an illness from a very young age. The historians are not sure, and doctors are not sure whether it was malaria or typhoid, something he contracted on an archaeological visit. But he died when he was 40. But while he was an invalid, and she would read to him. And she was only about between the ages of 10 and 11. And she would read everything she could lay her hands on, mostly Old Norse, Old Icelandic. She was very gifted with languages, and so she would read them in translation and then go back and look at the original language. So she was steeped in medieval history and medieval literature from a very, very young age. It really formed and shaped her imagination. After her father passed, there were some financial difficulties, but she still was sent to a very good private school. She hated it. It was very progressive. And so she left at the age of 16 and she became a secretary for 10 years in Oslo, Christiana, which is modern day Oslo, for an electrical company, and was also an aspiring writer. So she published a series of novels when she was in her early 20s, and then received a travel scholarship to go to Rome. And that's where she met a painter, Anders Svarstad, and they began an affair. He was married to a childhood friend of hers. She became pregnant. They met in 1909, and he divorced his wife, and they were married in 1912. Um, and they had 3 children together. The second was born, they had a son and then a daughter who was born with serious mental handicap, and then another son. And she also took in the 3 children from her husband's first marriage, one of whom was also mentally disabled. So she found herself very busy at a relatively young age. I mean, she didn't get married until she was 30. But after uh, a little over a decade, the marriage fell apart, and she devoted herself full time to mothering and writing. So that's kind of her early life in a nutshell, sort of pre-conversion, marked by many sort of hardships, some thrust upon her and some self-imposed.
Yes. Do you think you could speak to how her concerns for family, all of this caregiving that she has going on, shape her writing, either the fiction or other writing that she undertook?
Sure. So she um, there is a great deal that if we read about her life and we read her own writings, especially her letters, that we can see sort of reflected in the fiction. But she also, it just gives a really rich and sympathetic portrait of her as a human being and as a writer that unlike many writers who don't treat of motherhood with that kind of depth and richness, she really does that in all of her fiction. um, she when she's such an intellectual too. So there's a great letter when she's expecting her child, and she has this pen pal D, and she's writing all of her ideas about literature, all of her ideas about fiction, about life. And she pauses in the midst of this letter. She's writing from England because after they were, they're not married yet, but after when she's expecting, they moved to England for a short time, and she's sewing baby clothes. And she kind of muses about whether or not they should be made of cotton or wool. She's been to a doctor who's recommended wool as the fabric of choice. She lived in India for a decade or so, making various discoveries regarding the plague. She gave me some patterns for practical little garments, but she kept on preaching about woolen, woolen, woolen. There might be reason for it here in this barbaric country where it's always cold and damp and the houses are drafty and they don't have any other heat than these wretched fireplaces that you have to huddle close to in order to get a little warmth. But I don't know if it would be suitable in Rome. Of course, I'm sewing woolen clothes as outer garments, but I think the child should wear linen underneath. So just this attentiveness um, to motherhood, and early on, she's hailed as a feminist, and there's a very uh, right about this time, well, in 1912, she writes an essay that's been translated and published on a new book, feminist book by the American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Um, and she writes about the kind of perils of marriage and motherhood and how they can be, um, kind of deadening or dull or suffocating. But much of that is in the context of modern life. So, what she sees in the Middle Ages is the reclamation of the fullness of what it means to be a wife and a mother. And if you've read, Kristin Lavransdatter, the first thing that she does when she gets to the estate is she inherits the keys. And, there's a tremendous amount of responsibility and meaning attached to those activities in the home that she's able to tap into, both based on her own experience of the kind of modern denuding of all of that in modern life and women sort of moving outside of the home, but also her experience of reading about that in the lives of women in the Middle Ages. So
Um, in this time where she is, having this family, it's astonishing. I really want to pick her brain how she was basically a single mother of 5 or 6 children at once, writing enormous, many thousands of page historical novels about medieval times. Do you have any insight about how she went about her life as a writer?
I think she was very self-disciplined and very ordered. And she had some household help, but she also she had a very rich hidden prayer life once she converted. And her conversion in 1924 is when her children are still relatively young, and there's an account from one of the maids, about. Um, going up in the bedroom in the morning and, every morning seeing the indentations on her prie-dieu, on her, prayer cushion. So she was, I think, on her knees a lot, and I think that helped order and sustain her. Um, she also saw certain traditions and so her life and her family life were really structured around traditions. And some of those were a little more recent, but some of those were ancient. The putting out of a sheaf of wheat for the birds. This goes back to pagan times, but it becomes emblematic of Christianity at Christmas time. Norwegians put out sheaves of wheat for the birds, and so this is these kind of things being ordered and structured around the liturgical year, around the cycles of nature. Um, Really, I think, helped ground her family life and her just deep and sympathetic understanding for the value of every human life. And I think that was something she saw, the tenderness that her daughter gave her, in spite of her, well, in some respects, because of her limitations. So that was a real gift to her, I think.
Do you think that if you kind of then transition, as you've suggested, to talk a little bit about her conversion, her coming into Christianity? As you said, she comes from a family that isn't overtly religious. How does she go then into Catholicism in, Lutheran Norway?
Well, I like to think that she both reads and writes her way into the church. Obviously, she has this strong reading background in medieval literature, and not simply, uh, the uh, the lives, I mean, primarily the lives of the saints. But, when I read Kristin Lavransdatter, I see, The Dream of the Rue, the Canterbury Tales, there's just this rich, vast knowledge. She's such a scholar. And you can't read a lot of those works without it engaging with them imaginatively in the way that she had since she was a child. One of the most influential, I'd say the most influential work on her was medieval saga, Njal saga. So she had read much of pagan literature, but in Njal saga, halfway through, Iceland converts to Christianity, and um, the modern Penguin editor Robert Cook says it doesn't really have any bearing on the saga. It doesn't really change anything. But she understood, when she first read it, the impact that it had not only on what came after, but on what happened before. She has this understanding of the richness of the old heathenism, but it's because just give me a second. She has a great um quotation on that, if I can locate it, but it's basically, the old heathenism was a love song to a god they did not know, whereas the new heathenism is a rejection of a god that was known and people turned away from. And so she really saw that, Norway was, in the conversion of Norway, given something tremendously beautiful. And I think she went to a confirmation class with a Norwegian pastor, and she talks about it in this work, The Longest Years, which is an account of her life. It was originally called, it's in Norwegian, 11 years. And it's a great, it's presented as a fictional novel. The fictional character is Ingvild, and that's young Sigrid Undset. So it takes us up to her the time when her father passes. Um, but she muses as a child that she's going to become a free thinker. And then she says, not till she went to an Orthodox Lutheran West End clergyman to be prepared for confirmation and was given his version of the Orthodox Lutheran God of West Christiania did she grasp clearly that everybody believed God to be as he or she would like him to be. Everyone else's personal idea of God was equally unacceptable to her. She too had imagined God as she would prefer him to be. So she is confronted in her reading not with God as she would prefer him to be, but with God as he is. And then she's confronted with all these beautiful stories of the saints. And the saints, not as these kind of, plaster figures, but the saints as, those um who struggled, had the same struggles and overcame them. And so this whole class of intercessors, it slowly dawned on her, wait a minute, Saint Olaf, Norway's king for all eternity, what happened to him? Saint Halvard, Saint Sunniva, these are our saints. They're my intercessors. They're my friends. Called them, God's friends, and as the saints have always been called. But she, living in this atomized individual, shell, she had this deep need for friendship, and she found it satisfied in the lives of the saints. And so I really think that her encounter with the saints is the path to her conversion.
You said that she um, understood there to be a new heathenism that was sort of rejecting a god that had been known. Can you speak about how that's reflected in any of her writings that are not the medieval, but reflecting other aspects of later culture in Norway?
Yeah, so um, it's very interesting because I think that I think a lot of modern literature is grappling with unbelief, whereas I would say that the certainly the 2 medieval, novels, but even her post-conversion novels are grappling with belief. And so in that respect, they're less, um, palatable to a modern audience, um, in a way that or just incomprehensible. So there's um a great essay by Ida Kudnov, that she writes in 1930, right after the publication of, I think it was The Wild Orchid. So there's the two, The Wild Orchid and The Burning Bush. And she basically says, Sigrid Undset has one mode when talking about the faith, and it's the mode that the church has, and it's the heroic mode. And this beautiful, rich tradition collides in those novels with what Goras rightly identifies as the kind of kitschy, vapid, modern notion of the self or of religion. And it's really hard to take belief seriously. But that's what she's doing. It's much easier to do that for even a non-believer to do that in the medieval novels, because it's just assumed we're swimming in this rich treasury of the faith that's on every level, our liturgical life, our daily life, the hours of the day, everything as is built around this rich tradition. Whereas she saw, modern Norway as a kind of desolate landscape, where that heroic vision needed to be revived, but it's an uphill battle.
I mean, she when she tender takes the medieval novels, Kristin Lavransdatter, the one that she's most known for, is probably while she's, you know, beginning her conversion, but formally received after. Is that correct?
That's
And
right.
then Master of Hestviken is written after she becomes Catholic.
Yes.
Do you think you could speak a little bit about Master of Hestviken, less well known? That the one that we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of?
Well, the publication of the first half.
The first
So
half of it.
I've
Yeah.
been corrected by a prominent Norwegian scholar that most people think of it as a tetralogy, but it's actually published in 2 volumes. It's often, divided into 4 because it looks less daunting to see 2 or 300 pages instead of 6 or 700 in one volume. But the first half comes out in 1925. The second half comes out in 1927, and then she's awarded the Nobel Prize in 1928. But yeah, the 2 novels are similar in some respects, but very different in others. And I think that actually uh, there were more critical voices toward the Master of Hestviken than there were toward Kristin Lavransdatter, because um, ironically, there's kind of an irony here, if you talk about her as the novelist of mercy, because Kristin is engaged with God's mercy much earlier on in the novel in a very kind of active way. She wants to compel God to, withhold it on her terms. So she knows she's done wrong, and she has this kind of romanticized notion of how she's going to be punished for her sins. My wayside brat is going to be born deformed, or when or to compel God to declare her innocence when she puts her hand over the flame, and this kind of um, kind of calling God to reveal, either his mercy or his punishment to her. And it takes her a long time to figure out that she doesn't get to dictate the terms of either God's punishment or God's mercy. Um, and in But she's she has her moments, and they're always maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but she's not giving up, whereas Olaf, Olaf gives up, very early on in the novel, and, there are moments where he's contemplating, being restored to God's grace, but, boy, it takes a long time, and so, it it really is in that novel. I think about what Waugh says about Brideshead Revisited, about it being, the operations of grace on a set of characters. Um, in both novels, but especially in, Olaf Audenson, it's the operation of sin and what sin does. And, you don't get to, dictate the consequences of that sin. And there are always extenuating circumstances. There are always, the kind of, it seemed like a good idea at the time. But the consequences are something that, the aftershocks of that continue to be felt, and in ways that are wholly unexpected, wholly unanticipated. Um, I don't like to give spoiler alerts. We talked about this before.
Yeah.
Um, but just, one quick example from, Olaf Audenson. Um, when his, daughter's husband is murdered, and what is his default setting? He suspects his daughter of having done it, and that's precisely because he's absorbed with his own sin, his own unconfessed sin, and so he thinks, "Oh, I've polluted, you know, my children, I've polluted everything around me, everything I love, everything I touch." And in a very real sense, he has, but not in the way he thinks. And so there's always this, kind of, still, even when thinking about mercy and sin, and forgiveness, always still this focus on the self. And it's until you release that, the characters are really trapped. And again, I just think that's hard for, well, hard even for modern Catholic readers, but let alone, readers with no faith.
Yeah, I mean, she does communicate mercy, right, through relationships. And in the novels, the medieval novels, the priests um are the ones that give space for people to regret, right? And to stand by their vows, to stand by their mistakes. There's It's very striking how the Christianity is so new, relatively new and raw, and there is another culture, another kind of expectation that's really rivaling it. Um, and the characters are kind of uh prodded to maybe honesty through the conflicts that they have, um, and supported in the church. And I'm curious if she received criticism for this kind of um, portrayal of the church as being freeing in this sense, right? It seems very countercultural, that the church that calls you to acknowledge your sin is freeing, but this is sort of how it operates in the novels.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that, her prophecy that she would become a free thinker is true in the true sense of the word, because she finds that freedom in the church. And, you know, the those depictions again are, they're very realistic. Again, Gunolf in Kristin Lavransdatter, is not, again, some, cardboard saint who, he's not just spouting platitudes. And she didn't like that kind of writing.
Mhm.
She didn't like what she called mawkish sentimentality, or, anything that was sort of just cliches parroting out church doctrine. That's not what's going on. And yet it is an total irritant to modern critics, to many modern readers. Um, One scholar of Ibsen, um, wrote that her conversion was immoral.
Mhm.
And he borrowed this term from D.H. Lawrence, and he says, "Morality in the novel is the trembling instability of the balance. When the novelist puts his thumb in the scale, so to speak, to pull down the balance to his own predilection, that is immorality." So he just, there's a way in which you are not going to get it. And there's nothing that she can say or do that as a writer um, to make it anything other than it is. I mean, the one thing that her good friend Willa Cather says over and over again when describing her to other people in her letters is she is the most forthright, honest person that I know. And so she's not going to sugarcoat things in her writing with regard to the church, but she's not going to idealize it. I mean, her priests, I've read works by priests on her. Father Yaki wrote a whole book on her. Father Aidan Nichols. Priests find such a faithful depiction of priests and religious in their fullness in her writings, which they're really not given to my knowledge. In many other writings, particularly in fiction. So J.F. Powers, maybe.
I've also heard many people speak about how, convincing she is in writing fatherhood and men and, the whole saga of Olaf Odinson is, um, I think it overcomes, uh, I think it would almost overcome what you're describing, that you just have to believe, you have to buy what she's, waiting her thumb in, because you see him live it for so long in this world. And it's not our world, it's not the world of her time either. And so it's so different that it kind of allows you um, to buy it, right? Because it's both very different, very ancient, it's very all consuming. Um, but it's so meticulously detailed, just incredibly detailed, the aspects. And I don't know if this is, all of the reading she did to her father, all of the archaeological exposure, but it is so authentic.
Yeah, I mean, there is a realism that is born by her reading and her experience. Um, and but I also think, she just has that gift of a writer to have a sympathetic observation of human nature. Um, I mean, when I look at her depictions of children, and particularly of how children learn, how they absorb information for better or for worse, and the way she depicts that, artistically in her work by having a character spout something, and you as a reader think, "Wait a minute, how does Kristen know that?" Well, that's because she overheard some conversation 300 pages earlier in which they're talking about it. But that really is the case. I mean, it's borne out by experience. So just that vast sympathy that any great writer has to have for human experience, and that careful observation of the subtleties of how people um, uh, you know how people behave, but also how people, um, uh, fool themselves. In many instances, when Kristen says, "I didn't realize the consequence of sin was that you had to trample on other people." And she comes to that realization relatively late after we see the train wreck coming, in the way that any good writer is kind of giving a vision to their reader, often before the characters recognize it. But it is pretty incredible to see played out over, as you said, hundreds and hundreds of pages.
Do you think you could speak about the part of her life following the success of her career in Norway, the experience of the war, and then her coming to the United States? Such a really sort of tragic but fascinating transition that she has to
Yeah,
make.
tragic and fascinating. I mean, it really is the end of her abrupt end to her fiction career. She had written what I think was either supposed to be, I think it was supposed to be a trilogy, Madame Dorothea, set in 19th century. So historical, but not, you know, distant past. And she was at work on continuing that when the war broke out. Um, and she was forced to flee Norway because she was already, her books had been banned, and by the Nazis, and so she knew with the invasion that she was a ready target, that they would want to, use her, for propaganda purposes. So she fled to Sweden for a while. The she Her work, she wrote a work on her travels because after Sweden, then she went through Russia and then Japan and then into San Francisco and ended up, for several years in Brooklyn, New York, and she was, essentially writing, in support of, the Allies. Um, that book you mentioned earlier, Happy Times in Norway, that was one of a series commissioned by Eleanor Roosevelt, about childhood in these occupied countries, sort of just to hearken, um, back to simpler, happier days. And that's an interesting book to me because, um, I don't think it's embellished, but it's interesting what she chooses to write about, and it's autobiographical. So she's writing about her children. Her oldest son, Anders, is killed 12 miles from their home within a few weeks of the invasion, because he's enlisted. Um, but she says something really, quite, devastating at the beginning of that, Happy Times in Norway, in her introduction. When the Germans invaded Norway on April 9th, 1940, the happy times in our country came to an end. The two boys of whose childhood joys and adversities I have told in this book were young men by that time. Tulla, that's her, daughter, had died a year before. And since nobody could have explained to her why all the good things and pleasures she was used to had come to an end, why her dear flag could not fly over her home anymore, why there were to be no procession and music on the 17th of May, that's when Norway celebrates its independence, and no sheaves of grain for the birds outside her windows at Christmas, no rides to the mountains in the summer, no sledges with bells in the winter. It was a good thing she was dead. She was spared the sufferings inflicted upon her people by a nation who had deemed children like her not able to achieve anything in this world except teaching us love and tenderness and giving love and tenderness in return, unfit to live. So it's happy times in Norway, but she's under no illusion what the end game is for the.
I confess, when I heard that she wrote a book called Happy Times in Norway, I was like, "Really?" So, yeah, I can the that it was commissioned as part of, the, propaganda effort makes sense. But she really is so bold, not pulling any punches there, and
Yeah.
it
So
it connects with what you see of, um, the dignity of children and the sort of dignity of caring for dependents
mm,
in all circumstances that isn't reflected in all these other works.
yeah. Yeah, and the kind of recognition of, human frailty as a part of human existence, that this scientific quest for perfection in any realm is a dangerous thing. She writes, her last work, published posthumously, it's her biography of St. Catherine of Siena, And the last line of that work is, "We sorely need the wisdom of the saints." She sees all of these problems as pervasive, problems that are not going to be solved overnight, and even when the war ends, it is, she goes back to a very, very changed, very diminished Norway. And it does, you know, it does dim her spirit a great deal. Um, but she recognizes, on a fundamental level, that her hope isn't in this world, as the saints, as she says, the saints recognize. She doesn't give up on this world. And one of the beautiful things about her time in America, and we talked about this when we met virtually last week, is her deep friendship, with many, American writers, and particularly, Willa Cather and Marjorie Kinnon's Rawlings. Um, and she and Willa Cather, continually exchange seeds. So when she did go back to Norway, she's planting black-eyed Susans, and she's trying to plant dogwoods, and, things that she had grown to appreciate and love in America, because they reminded her of her native land. Um, and because she retained the hope that she'd be able to restore that Norway would be able to reclaim some of those things after the war.
Um, what was her connection with Catherine of Siena? And that was her last published work, the biography.
Right, right. Well, she'd always, I mean, she had read about St. Catherine of Siena very early on, and she knew many Dominicans in Norway. And she herself became a Dominican tertiary. She took the name Olaf, the feminine form of Olaf. But she had been, wanting to write, on St. Catherine for a long time, and this was, I think, in many ways, reading the work, it's almost like an Kristin. St. Catherine has presented the world very early on, and all the pleasures that the world has to give. And, she says, "No, I want this." Whereas, Kristen's presented the world, and, you know, um, she recognizes early on, I think there's some quotation early on, she wasn't ready to give up her heritage of beauty and goodness. She didn't wanna cut her hair short, and,
Yes.
you know
Both had lovely hair.
Yes, yes. So I think she recognized, that, and also just the tenacity and the strength, um, of Saint Catherine of Siena, living through, very tumultuous times in the church, um, and maintaining, the truth throughout that, so.
Yeah, I think we are ready for questions. Thank you. We made it all the way to the um the last published work. Do you want to take some questions? I can read them.
Sure, sure.
You can respond. Okay. We have a question about her study, her background. Did she study philosophy or theology?
She didn't have any, university training at all. She read, voraciously on her own, um, and I would say that the majority of her studies are in literature and theology. She has, it's in a book called Stages on the Road. She has chapters on, the Catalan mystic, Ramon Lull. She has chapters on the English martyrs, Robert Southwell and Margaret Clitheroe. The last work she's working on, which I'm assuming somewhere in, the archives in Norway, is the manuscript, is a work on Edmund Burke. So I don't know if she studied, political philosophy before that. She certainly read theology through her encounter with, um, the English writers of the early 20th century. She loved Robert Hugh Benson. She translated 3 of his works. She loved Chesterton. She translated The Everlasting Man. She loved Belloc. She didn't translate any Belloc, but she did have a fondness for him. So to that extent, but as far as, you know, um, and she knew, Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas, but it was not any, formal educational training.
This is related somewhat. Did she have access to libraries, mentors, other scholarly resources? Was she primarily working independently?
Yeah, no, she was, I mean, she was part of the literary, in, she was a known literary figure in Norway, and she was in close association with, many Norwegian scholars, many Danish scholars, scholars of medieval history, of the Danish ballads, she interacted with a wide variety of scholars and writers, and artists. I mean, she herself did some painting, but she stayed involved in arts. The night before the Nazi invasion, she was at a meeting of um, Norwegian artists, so writers, painters, composers, and she knew that some among them knew about the impending invasion. They were sympathetic toward, socialism, and so there was a kind of growing, break with the, literary intelligentsia of Norway, um, and the Scandinavian countries because she saw the direction they were going in. A writer like Knut Hamsun, I mean, it is that's a sort of tale of two Norwegians that should be better told because, um, they were the two Nobel Prize winners. He won in 1920, she won in 1928. She gave her prize money for the plight of Finnish refugees. He gave his Nobel medal to Goebbels to further the war effort. So they're really, even though she did have interactions, and she did have access to libraries and to looking at manuscripts and things like that, but I would call her more of an independent researcher. She wasn't associated with any particular university that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Another question is asking about parallels between her work and Flannery O'Connor. Do you see them between these authors? And would you recommend O'Connor fans read Unset's work?
I would. I mean, I love this is my Flannery O'Connor mug. When in Rome, do as you've done in Milledgeville. I mean, I love both writers. That is a very interesting question. Yeah, I absolutely would. I think that um part of the incongruity of O'Connor's fiction is this encounter with grace in a very changed modern context in which it is kind of shocking and unexpected. And I think we see the beginnings of that in a writer like Sigrid Undset in her trying to, create a space for belief in a very as Ida Gore says, a very kitschy, denuded world. And I wouldn't say that Sigrid Undset has anything like the comic grotesque vision of Flannery O'Connor, but I think she would be sympathetic to it. She, just based on those novels and her writing, she has this great line in Saga of Saints. There's a character in Njal's saga, Hallgerda, who is just awful. She is the one who causes the death of her husband because he's being attacked, and she slapped him at some point. And you don't slap Hallgerda. She's already two husbands have already, gone out of the picture, out of the saga because they slapped her. And he says, I need a hare to restring my bow, one of your hairs." And she says, "What depends on it?" And he says, "My life." And then she says, "Then I'll remember that slap you gave me." And so there's a story um, that Sigrid Undset recounts in the Saga of Saints about Hallgerda, that she lived to a ripe old age. Gunnar dies a pagan. She lives to a ripe old age and becomes a Christian. And she says, "It pleases me to think that Gunnar died a pagan, but that I was able to become a Christian." And Sigrid Undset says that was what she got out of her conversion. And so the kind of ironic humor there, I think, is, and that kind of, stubbornness. I think it's no accident that the last work that Andrew Lytle wrote was at the age of 92, was simply a short volume called Kristin. That was his reflections on the novel. And he says, "I know these people. I grew up with them. I think any kind of close community like the South of Flannery O'Connor, or like Sigrid Undset's Norway, they're going to have these kinds of localisms and affinities that um, create, a certain kind of tension that when you add grace into the picture, comes out in startling ways." So yes.
Um, so we have had a number of questions about her reading. Which did she correspond with other writers? You mentioned Willa Cather, you mentioned Chesterton. Are there other notable Catholic writers on the US side, or uh,
Yeah.
English authors?
So, a lot of the correspondence that's in Norwegian. I don't speak or read Norwegian, sadly. If I have a chance in my lifetime to remedy that, I intend to. But in the meantime, I'm left with what has been translated and what is in archives in the US. So we know she corresponded quite a bit, during her time when she was in New York, with a number of Americans. So I have looked at archives of unpublished letters between um, that she wrote with an American medievalist, Hope Emily Allen. And Hope Emily Allen came out with the book of Marjorie Kemp that was published, I think first maybe in the late 30s. It was found in England in a drawer, and so it hadn't been known of before that. And then in I think in the late 90s, in her estate in Norway, they found a trove of additional letters from Willa Cather to her and from her to Willa Cather, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think there's probably a lot out there that we don't know about. But a lot of her letters were written to family members, back in Norway. And I mean, I think her correspondence with Willa Cather is just exquisite, and reveals such a deep friendship.
Is there an anecdote from that correspondence? Yeah.
Oh, an anecdote. Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think um, there's they're always getting each other flowers, as I mentioned, and getting super excited about, here's this book by this naturalist. And um but what I particularly love is Willa Cather's descriptions of Sigrid Undset, because it gives us such a full picture of her. So I'm just going to read this. This is a letter that Cather wrote to her Carrie. Oh, what is Carrie's last name? But one of her dear friends in Nebraska. And she says Cather's been going through a series of personal crises with her parents and her brother. She says, "I want to tell you all about Madame Undset. She was here last night and spent the evening. Every time I see her, she brings a large peace and relaxation. She is just all a great woman should be, and on a giant scale. She's a wonderful cook, a proficient scholar, and has the literature of 4 languages at her fingers' ends. There is nothing about wildflowers and garden flowers that she doesn't know, and she's able to make plants thrive and bloom in her very humble and gloomy little hotel rooms. Besides all this, there is in the woman a kind of heroic calm and warmth that rises above all the cruel tragedies and loss of fortune that the last 3 years have brought. She simply surmounts everything that has been wrecked about her and stands large and calm. She who has lost everything seems still to possess everything, and the small pleasures can still make her rather cold eyes glow with marvelous pleasure. She combines in herself the nature of an artist, a peasant, and a scholar. She is cut on a larger pattern than any woman I have ever known, and it rests me just to sit and look at her strength that stood unshaken through so much. Of course, of her son's murder in a German concentration camp, she never speaks. Now he didn't die in a concentration camp, he was shot to death. But just, that is just such a Willa Cather wasn't above, critiquing faults in others either. She was a very truthful woman, and her portrait um, remains consistent. And I think that she has a very sympathetic but a very accurate read of Sigrid Undset. In another one, she says something like something about her being um, terrifying, but also as gentle as a lamb. So she has this kind of, uh, you know, what we might characterize as Norse, kind of strength and giant, just, kind of Viking,
Yeah.
largeness, but also gentleness.
She's calm until it's time to grab the axe off the
That's
wall.
right. That's right.
Um, so we have time for one more question. Fortunately, we couldn't get to all of them. Um, and this is an appropriate question. Is there any chance that she could be canonized?
Yes. I think there
Hopefully, yeah.
I think
Is there anything afoot?
anything afoot. So I am not, I am not, I know I keep hearing murmurs and reading little hints that, the, Dominicans in Norway and the ordinary of her diocese have, explored this possibility. I know that there's I think, a lot of times obviously the first step is a groundswell of popular devotion. So I have certainly asked for her intercession. I don't know if others have as well, but I think the more that becomes either locally and I think there's a lot of things happening spiritually within the church in Norway right now that suggests she is, somehow, interceding. There's Matthias Ladum was just ordained a deacon in her hometown in Lillehammer. I think it's the first vocation in hundreds of years in that village with vestments that she had donated to the church. So there are some very beautiful things. I mean, there's all these pilgrimages that are growing. The pilgrimage to Trondheim for Saint Olaf or Saint Sunniva and the Seljemen to Selja Island. I mean, those are really vibrant pilgrimages right now, and I think all of that will continue. So, 2030 is the 1,000th anniversary of the martyrdom of Saint Olaf, and so we have several years to promote the cause.
Yeah. I'm sure she's invested as her patron saints, name saints. Great feast of 1,000 years. That's the anniversary of the martyrdom of
Yes,
Saint Olaf,
yes.
2030. So learn your Norwegian, friends. So you prepare. Um, Well, thank you so much, everyone who's attended, very well attended. And thank you so much, Dr. Fahey and the IHE team for pulling this together.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.